So once again, welcome everyone, and hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon for some people, depending on where you're joining from, and it's happy Monday and happy Tuesday, depending on where you're joining from. So it's really nice to see all of you here. Thank you very much for taking the time to be here today. This event is about to really set up an all-inclusive primer on the fourth industrial revolution and the future of work. What's the big deal about 4IR? Well, for starters, it is not the amount of change that's happening. It's more about the velocity of it, the speed with which change is happening, and how everything is becoming digitized, and there is a lot of it's like a melding of the physical and the digital worlds in a sense. And the fact that this affects every industry, every country, every type of economy, that's what makes it something to stop and really think about. So when I started thinking about doing something that is of value, that's global, that's inclusive, and also something that needs to be talked about, but not a lot of people are doing that, and that's how I landed on this theme of the fourth industrial revolution and the future of work. And what I really wanted to do was bring together people from within my network, both folks that I've known for a long time and worked with as for over several years, and folks that I've met recently that we sort of really clicked. And so the group of speakers, the 21 of us, including myself, we are all people that I've known for many years, and people that I've just recently met, and several of us we have not met in person. We've only done Zoom meetings, and we connected via LinkedIn. So likes of, Hema and Erica, and I'm just looking at the screen here. Catherine, although she's so close by, we all have just met virtually. So I found that when I look back at this, the theme really reflects the work that this team has put together, really reflects the theme. It is the digital economy, and this is the new way of working, where you really don't have to, where there's a lot that's possible without really being face to face. And this group and this team and this event is proof of that. This morning, US time, Ann Steiner, VP of Product Agility at C Prime, which is a technology consulting company and also platinum partner of Atlassian, kicked us off. I mean, I could not have asked for a better way and a better context setting. And so, she really tied all of the different pieces that all the speakers are going to talk about. How she did it, I have no idea, because none of us have met and talked about what we're going to talk about. So I guess she just went off of everybody's abstracts. So she really laid out the structure and the tapestry of the themes, if you will. And so what David here is going to do for us is really pick up on one of the threads that Anne started this morning, and talk to us about his insights and experience in this in collaborative agility, collaborative leadership, and how that plays a role, how that's a tool for an inclusive approach to organizational agility. David and I have worked together for about 3 years. I had the privilege of being on his team for 3 years, and he's my mentor. I've learned a whole lot from him and continue to do so, which he comes with X number of decades of experience. We won't reveal how many. And he's a global leader and a finance and technology executive with a lot of diverse experience, international career, and someone who I strongly believe really personifies collaborative leadership. The ideas that he has tried to implement that I've been a part of include reverse mentoring, include shadow boards for companies. So there's a lot of great things that I've learned from him and continue to do so. So without further ado, over to you, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Boy, that was pretty good. I really appreciate the very kind introduction, and looking forward to sharing some thoughts with everyone else. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. And
And while David's doing that, please keep the conversation and the questions going in the chat window. We'll take all the questions towards the end. I'll help David call out the questions and go from there. And those who are joining us just now, please feel free to let us know where you're dialing in from, city, state, and country, and we'll keep the conversation going on the chat window. That's about it. Over to you, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Mino. And thanks again for really bringing us together and being the driving force behind these next few days. I'm excited to be a part of it. And I really, as I reflected on preparing for what I wanted to share with each of you, I really was quite taken by the fact that, having not met many of the folks who are presenting over the next few days, having not spent a lot of time prepping my individual conversation or thoughts relative to that with the others, how absolutely aligned we are as we share some of our thoughts and ideas. I think that when Minu talked about this notion of 4IR, or the fourth industrial revolution and the future of work, and referenced the 2016 Davos meeting, which is where this conversation actually started, I felt very much like driving, looking in the rearview mirror, or maybe watching the Michael Fox movie Back to the Future. And for me, it is very much about that, except that I don't think one drives very successfully by looking in the rearview mirror. And so what I want to try to do is to take that notion of Back to the Future, marry it with the concept of all of the things that we're experiencing today, and in particular over the last 3 or 4 months, and really sort of try to create a bit of a forward-looking view for leadership, and leadership in a time of tremendous change. A little bit about me as we sort of go through this, and Nino is right. I won't tell you quite the number of decades, although it is decades. I'll instead focus on what I describe as a long international career, and really grateful for the opportunity that I had in that regard. I'm originally from the Caribbean. Maybe my accent doesn't quite give it away. But I spent my early childhood in the Caribbean, my education in Dublin, Ireland, and subsequently in the US. And much of that career was in the area of banking, FinTech and Health IT, and particularly health product IT. And I don't know that my wife Beverly would like me describing her as the trailing spouse. I think in many ways she was actually the leading spouse. But as a Canadian who followed me to the Caribbean, when I had that conversation with my manager in probably January or February, when we were living in Toronto, and the question was asked of me whether I'd be interested in going back to the Caribbean, it didn't at that time of the year take a heck of a long time for me to provide the answer. But I say that in the context of sort of then having Beverly set the stage as the first time in the Caribbean with 2 small children in tow. In fact, our daughter was, I think, 4 weeks at the time that we made the move. So I was grateful for the sacrifice and the opportunity to make that move, and we spent then much of the next number of years in various countries within the Caribbean, working initially for a large Canadian bank and then subsequently for the largest community bank in the Cayman Islands. So fun experience, hard to replicate, really grateful for the opportunity to have done that. And part of the reason that I was particularly happy in so doing was that I had the opportunity to work with teams on some pretty transformative programs. It was a time then of change in the fintech, in the financial services and fintech space. And so we were really trying to understand how we were going to transform the brand of the organization, how we were going to transform our delivery strategies, and how we were going to serve our customers better. My career later brought me to the US, and I've since had the opportunity to participate in leadership roles in both larger publicly traded companies and mid-size private equity, privately owned organizations, but each with a pretty global flair. And so if there is a common thread throughout my career, I would describe it as that sort of international exposure, both personally and professionally, that transformative opportunity of working with cross-functional teams and cross-cultural teams, and really beginning to understand pretty early on that technology is a great enabler for success across the entire stakeholder community. And I use the word stakeholder fairly purposefully because it is broader than just a shareholder's view of the world, but it's a view of the world from an employee's perspective, certainly from a customer's perspective, and then from a shareholder's perspective. So grateful for that opportunity, and that's sort of a little bit about me and kind of frames the experience that I bring to the conversation. I looked at the title and realized that it had a lot in it, and I was a little bit nervous about trying to deliver content that covered all of those elements. So if I may, I'd like to maybe unpack the title just a little bit. And I think there are sort of 4 broad perspectives that I'd like to spend some time talking about over the next few minutes. One is this notion of collaborative leadership and maybe challenging that a little bit. Organizational agility and the ability of organizations to move from a very traditional approach to running a business to one that embraces agility in a truly meaningful way. Globalization and importantly from my perspective, inclusion. And I say that because I think it is much more than just a global presence. It is much more than just having an operation in some other part of the world, but it is very much about what we learn from an inclusive, multicultural perspective as we deliver on meeting global strategies and objectives in the organization. And then importantly for me, the 3 legs to the stool of people, product, and process. And I'd like to talk a little bit about my perspective in that regard, what I see as important, maybe less important, and just create some opportunity for conversation in that regard. I love the word oxymoron, and I don't know why I do, but I think it's such a great sounding word. But in the context of collaborative leadership, I'd like to ask the question of you, and if you provide a very brief, even 1-word response in the chat box, then we can come back to this at the end of the conversation and maybe use it as the opportunity for additional conversation. But this notion of collaborative leadership, is it really a conflict that has been resolved, or is it something different than that? And are they elements or words that sort of, in terms of execution, are difficult to align and bring together? And I'll just stop for a moment to give everyone a chance to make a comment. We'll come back to that at the end, but thanks for providing your responses. So my experience suggests that there are both. I have worked with leaders who are very, very directive. I have worked with leaders who value collaboration and inclusion. I have a view of the type of leader that I have tried to become over the years. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But for me, the important thing is that we have an opportunity in this time of rapid change, in this time of the kind of transformational opportunity and challenge that exists, to importantly create more leaders. I used to say it somewhat jokingly initially, but over time, more and more seriously, as I saw the opportunity, that one of the greatest things that I could do as a leader was to work myself out of a job. And in order to do so effectively, one has to create the right environment to grow and empower and build more leaders in the organization. And how do we do that? Well, so from my perspective, this notion of inspiring a shared vision is absolutely critical to building leadership skills. So many of the programs that I have been involved in executing looked really different at the end than they did at the start. And from my perspective, what caused that was the right opportunity of having conversation with the folks on the team, taking ideas and not causing any idea to be considered bad, but really using it as a basis of inspiring and building a shared vision, of challenging existing processes together. You've heard, I'm sure, the comment that in everything that we do, culture, whether it be corporate culture or otherwise, really beats process and business objective and vision every single time. But it doesn't beat it when you have an environment in which you can create the shared vision of leadership, of engagement, of creating the right objectives and working together. And I do believe that a big part of respecting the culture that has brought the organization to where it is today, but also allowing the organization to move beyond that culture, is as a consequence of a term that I've heard on many occasions, and very recently, of this notion of encouraging the heart. I think that helping the heart to build an engagement in what is intended as part of that vision, of causing the heart to embrace that direction, is actually a fundamental and significant part of building a new culture, because the head typically will follow, the heart always leads. And so this notion of collaborative leadership, in my view, is much about creating and encouraging the right environment for everyone to be inspired by this vision of where are we taking the organization and this participation in that shared vision. My very first manager, when I first started my career, talked about this in the context of really understanding collaboratively what the business objectives were and how do you get people to engage in that conversation and make them a part of the direction that is being intended. Is organizational agility just a buzzword? And maybe I asked that question from a leadership perspective, but I'd be interested in your thoughts in that regard. I think that we've used the term pretty freely over the years. I'm not sure that if I asked each of you on this call what agility means or how do you apply agility, that I wouldn't get a different answer from each of you. It is important that we understand where Agile works and where it doesn't work. And it doesn't work in every part of an organization, at least at the outset. What we do with it, how we introduce it and use it across the organization, starts out small, but can create the environment. If we can create the environment where that opportunity grows in an organic fashion, then we can begin to see Agile manifest itself across other parts of the organization. And if I may, for a moment, from an executive leadership perspective, talk about my own experience, I think it is really important to understand agility, not just in the context of status meetings, but in the context of the involvement of everyone on that leadership team playing a role in terms of understanding organizational agility, understanding their roles and their team's role in that Agile process, and giving them a part to play. I have worked in environments where, because of my operational background, it was my role to bring Agile to the organization. And you know what? I don't care how good you are, and I hope I was pretty good, but it is impossible if the organization as a whole, if the executive leadership as a whole doesn't understand what it is, how the execution of it is going to work, and how and what their involvement and their team's involvement is going to be. Because beyond corporate culture, the other thing that is a tremendous barrier to developing organizational agility is the silos that normally and naturally grow within an organization as it increases in size and complexity and teams. It is very difficult without engagement of all to do what is absolutely critical, which is to break down those barriers or obstacles to establishing an Agile process. And so one has to create the environment which allows you to practice agility from the very top of the organization through the organization. There's one Kiwi on the call, and so I talk about rugby. I wasn't a great rugby player, but I was an okay rugby player. But when you think of the Scrum process, and I think of the All Blacks as I think about this, that, you know, probably the best, consistently best rugby team in the world. And my Irish colleagues will be upset at me for saying that, and others, but pretty darn good team. And you think about how they customize their practices and how they build their processes around their team. And they actually grow that within their team structure and their team organization, and how they work together and they own the result together. It's pretty clear why Agile and Scrum have represented, in many ways, such an aligned conversation and process. So allow teams to customize their practices, allow teams to own their results, allow teams to make changes as required, within a framework, obviously. And the framework is important, but it shouldn't be so restrictive. Let's talk a little bit about this notion of globalization and inclusion, and particularly as a consequence maybe of some of what we've heard and seen over the last several months. Is globalization in fact dead in many ways. I'm interested in your thoughts because there has been a lot of conversation around this notion. And I'm not just talking about the immigration aspects. I'm not just talking about the socio-economic aspects, but I'm talking about this notion of globalization as a business strategy and operation, and whether it can continue to exist and grow and improve. So for me, it's important that one be clear on what it means to you, because it does mean different things to different people. For some, it's purely a staff augmentation program, one that improves the cost of labor depending on the location that you're using. For others, it's a customer-driven strategy. But whatever it is, it needs to be clear to the organization as to what it means and how it impacts the direction and growth of the organization. One has to understand what the benefits and objectives and management goals are, and importantly, what the daily activities are against your established target. You know, having done this for a while, having taken a location in the south of India, which started with 20 people on staff and grown it to 500, and then having taken a fairly loosely constructed team of folks in Hyderabad and helped to bring some better alignment of process and delivery to that team of over 300 people. I think it is really important that we think about how we do global well, how we do inclusion well. And I think there are really sort of three aspects as I've learned this, studied it, experienced it, that are important. There's the notion of coaching. There's the notion of training, two very different things. And then there's the notion of experience. And for me, and not unlike some of the research that I've read on this, the part that is most impactful is that aspect of experience. I remember the first time I landed in Trivandrum many, many years ago, and my many subsequent trips across various other parts of India. And for me, the experience made such a huge difference in terms of how I was approaching the folks that I was working with and how they were approaching me. And it became less about how do I coach and train, or how do they take that learning, and more about how we identified as individuals working for a common goal and in a similar manner. And it is so different to communicate with folks via email purely against communicating with folks when you have had the experience of seeing them at work, understanding their management challenges, understanding the opportunities, and how do you leverage that experience. I had a philosophy that all of my managers would have the opportunity either to travel from wherever that country was, more often than not in my own experience, India, or to the US, or for the US managers to travel to India. It made such a huge difference in terms of the results that we saw after those relationships were established, after people understood better all of the nuances of working together and why a conversation would happen in a certain way. And I think only then can you really deal with this notion of addressing some of the supply chain challenges that we see in today's environment. How we create the right risk management and business continuity processes that are critical to the success of how we work. Because after all, we are only as strong as the weakest link in the chain. And so understanding how we mitigate against those and making that a part of a business continuity plan that considers that is really critical to success. For me, the excitement is in the execution. And I well remember the first time I saw a piece of work being handed by a US-based team to an India-based team, and the known expectation of what would be delivered back to the US-based team the following day. And seeing that chain work effectively and work move through the process effectively and get delivered faster and get delivered better as a consequence of understanding the process, understanding the end product. To use Srini's term, understanding what the definition of done looks like and how you get to that is really critical to the success of this. And that's why I talk again about the end-to-end integration of not just people, but also product and process, and those three elements. That's my argument for a balanced approach. You know, it's a time of great change, and we know that organizational agility is important. We understand that an unbalanced organization, and many are centered on one part of the organization versus another. Some are very technologically based and don't have as strong a center in sales. Some are very sales based and don't have a very strong center in technology. Finding the right balance and being comfortable as a leader operating at the intersection of these three legs of the stool, I think is a really important aspect of successfully managing change within an organization. We have 4 different generations in the workforce today, all at the same time. And I can tell you that the way I work is different than the way my kids work. The way I view work is different than the way my kids view work. And understanding how we motivate and work within those parameters is really very, very important. And the change will be here for a while. It's also a time of change in technology and understanding how things get done. I try to be committed to lifelong learning. I try to think about, I don't always get it done, but I try to think about what do I need to learn to be more effective in the day-to-day execution of my work and my life. I play around with technology just enough to be dangerous at it. But it is a time of great change in technology. And as we think about the way technology has evolved over the years, and you have these big spikes, and then a plateau, a period of plateau where the technology gets embraced and better understood and better utilization. We are at that cusp of, I think, a monstrous change in technology, in the use of artificial intelligence, in the use of machine learning, and in the opportunity that it's going to provide for us to be successful in growing our respective businesses, for businesses indeed to survive, and many won't. And more important than anything else for me is the change in customer expectations. We're hearing what they're saying, right? I don't know that I don't have a perspective in some of the other countries outside of the US right now, but we have this goal of reopening the economy. But you're also hearing the discomfort by many of the customers of, are we ready to reopen the economy? We've talked about what that needs to look like and how we create the right environment where customers' expectations are that they are safe, that they are secure, that they can be kept healthy. Back in 2008, 2009, when we went through the recession, in part involving the financial services, in large part involving the financial services space and some of the issues that happened there, we started talking then about customer experience and how we improve that experience and the digitization process that was required and how do we operationalize that. We're still talking about it, and it's important that we continue, but are we really understanding the customer's desires and needs to allow us to create the right approach to serving our customers? So I think in all of this, in this balanced approach, I declare my preference for the third, one of the three legs of the stool of people, because I think that engagement of people, that understanding of the customer will drive the other pieces of product and processes, not to make them less important, but I think that engagement and rebuilding the organization and transforming it from the customer back becomes an incredibly important part of how you execute for success and how you stay and get more relevant in today's world. So some things that I want to leave you with and maybe cause some additional reflection for you as we spend some time together at the end of the formal part of my presentation. And also, by the way, as we get to engage during the panel session this coming Friday, or maybe Saturday, but Friday, I think, is this notion of success lying at the intersection and the balance of people, product, and process initiatives. Getting really good at operating in that squishy space is absolutely critical for success. Change is not easy, and anyone who tells you they like change maybe is not being completely honest. We embrace change because we have to. We have to as part of a business transformation process. And what makes it a little bit easier, I think, to embrace it is this notion of being very thoughtful about our planning and very purposeful in our execution of change initiatives. Being willing to focus on and celebrate the small stuff, the small wins. I've had more programs and projects generate success by taking the time to do the right amount of planning up front and taking the time to celebrate and focus on the small stuff. And be balanced in your approach, but really, really execute with rigor and inspect what you expect. So measurement is absolutely critical. So I keep saying some of the same things and themes over and over, and let me tell you why. I think it is really important to be repetitive in establishing a shared vision and articulating that shared vision. And I learned that from my kids, because when I would say the same thing the fifth time over, they would often roll their eyes and say, "Oh, here he goes again." But at some future date, I knew that it came back to them in their thinking. And the same is true in terms of organizational management. I think being very, very focused on communicating and communicating with great repetitiveness becomes important. I used to talk to many of our employees about being able to close your eyes and visualize what the end goal looked like. And having that end goal firmly planted in your mindset. Because, you know, the yellow brick road can go a whole bunch of different places. The bridge to nowhere can go a whole bunch of different places if you don't have your business objective in mind and your plan and how you get there. Humility is absolutely critical, and I've seen so much writing about this over the last many weeks and months and beyond that. And it's easy to say, and oftentimes more difficult to truly execute on. But this notion of being willing to learn from those around you is absolutely critical in terms of really being a leader in this fourth industrial revolution who can be effective. There's just way too much happening very quickly to be good at everything. And so the ability to understand where you can take guidance from others and be humble in that approach is critical. Be curious, be willing to experiment. That's true in life, it's also true in business. No one gets it right the very first time. And so this notion of, as a leader, being willing to experiment with an outcome, I think is an absolute, very important aspect of leadership. And that means being forgiving, because mistakes will happen. If one does experiment, the natural consequence of that is that mistakes will happen. And so make sure you have the organizational structure in place that allows you to learn from those mistakes. But don't expect that they won't occur. And for me, probably the most important, or the aspect that I focus on most, is how have I been able to use my positional authority, my positional responsibility to be supportive of my team. There are obstacles, all kinds of them. Product readiness, process readiness, communication style, making sure that those around you in other leadership positions understand the objectives and the involvement of folks, creating the right experience for those team members so that they can learn and be a part of that change initiative. And the ability to make sure that those obstacles get taken out of the way is, I think, one of the great opportunities for leaders to thrive as they look to build their teams, as they look to build their organizations. I didn't mention it at the beginning, but there's been lots of reading and writing around this notion of VUCA. I don't know if all of you have heard the acronym. I had a really good salesperson who worked with me at one of my prior positions in the FinTech space. And he used to use a somewhat similar acronym during the sales process. He referred to it as FUD, F-U-D. And the very first time I asked him how we were doing on a sales opportunity, a very important and significant opportunity, he said, we're at that FUD stage. And I said, well, what does that mean? And really what it represented was that the incumbent vendor was creating fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the mind of the potential consuming client. Are you sure they can deliver what they say they can deliver? Are you sure the product works? All of those things. When I read about VUCA, it felt a lot the same to me. In many ways, this notion that we live in volatile times. Volatility drives uncertainty. Complexity drives uncertainty, and there's certainly a lot of that. And ambiguity, and I used to talk about ambiguity with some of my managers in my last position, where I said, you know, you have to get comfortable operating with a certain degree of ambiguity around you. But you know, maybe I was somewhat right, but only partially so. So like other folks who have looked at this acronym in recent times and talked about how do you operate in that sort of environment, I have taken on some of their approaches of positivity towards it. So how can you take the uncertainty and the complexity and the volatility with which change is occurring and turn that into a vision? How can you help in conversation to establish alignment and clarity in terms of the objectives that you're looking to accomplish? And understanding is a really important part of that. So please go back to my communicate objective or thought in my last slide. They're in the Caribbean, and not so much now because piped water is more regular. But in the days before water was available to all of the individual homes within a village, there was something called a standpipe. I don't know if you've ever heard that term, but it is a spot within the center of one of the villages. And I talk about my Barbados experience here. And there's a big pipe that is somewhere supported by a big bowl or concrete stand. And the kids go there to bathe, the kids go there to play in the water, people go there to get water back to their house, but it's also a place for the village meeting and having conversations and jokes and while the kids are playing. But there's one thing that is consistent in each of those locations, and that is that there is a dripping pipe or faucet, and it never gets fixed. And the dripping water has the ability of cutting through the stone in that concrete bowl or that concrete stand. And I use that as I think about this concept of the repetitive nature and the engaged nature of making sure that as you communicate, as you strive for alignment and clarity, as you strive for understanding, be the dripping pipe that understands the objectives and seeks the clarity and cut the stone that's there because of the fact that you are focused on your communication strategies and style. Thank you for listening. I think we're going to have an opportunity for maybe a little bit of Q&A. So I hope that that some of what I've said has been helpful, maybe thought-provoking, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be a part of this with me.
So my question is that in your experience, the multitude of decades of experience that you have, what has been what has been your challenge and your triumph in changing process? And obviously, when there is a lot of process, it makes people sad because if the process doesn't lend itself for repeatable success, then that's where you lose the people, and then you lose the people and the product suffers. So what has been your experience in collaborative leadership to bring in a process change or make it more lightweight?
Thank you. It's a wonderful question. I think that one of the things that I have found to be incredibly challenging is that process piece, which gets bound around regulatory constraints and all of those aspects that make it difficult to execute, can be really better understood and addressed if one creates the right organizational structure around it. And in each of the opportunities that I was involved in, one of the most critical roles to the process was a cross-functional one that was involved in business process delivery, change management, and learning. And so we addressed it by trying to establish an upfront objective that we were going to minimize that. We were going to build it into the process. So go back to this notion of agility, right? And cross-functional teams. And I think the hard thing, but the important thing, is to ensure that in developing those processes, in approaching the change management initiative, one has to have a way to really look at and interrogate the way you did business before and take an approach that says, okay, if I had those 10 steps, my objective is to create it with 5 steps. If I have those 5 steps, how do I document those in a more user-friendly way of defining and delivering the product? And we didn't always succeed, but that was a really important part of what we strove for, both in the healthcare space and in the fintech space. And managing that alongside a knowledge management strategy, a just-in-time learning strategy, and I saw somebody else on this call who was a big part of that. I don't know if she's still on. I won't call her out because she'll get shy on me. But that's a really important aspect in the whole delivery of this. So really look at it cross-functionally. Look at the steps up front and say, how do I minimize these? Look at how you align it to your whatever your objective is, and then create the environment that allows it to be documented as customer friendly, and I use customer in the context of the employee, but consumer friendly way that can then be integrated into the learning process. Minu will be too shy to tell you, but she ran that part of the organization for me. So Minu, you can say it better than me, but would you say it different?
No, I wouldn't. I think it was what we did, David, and to Padma, to your point, under David's leadership, what we accomplished was a combination of using human-centered design and lean. So that's where understanding the customer standpoint, and I think the biggest challenge I would say that we faced was in helping our own employees understand that we are one another's customers. That if you look at our value chain, it's like an assembly line, and the product of my job is somebody else's input. And so if the understanding, and that's where we worked with Srini as well as a consultant who came in and did a lot of work with us on Scrum coaching as a starting point. Understanding of collective ownership So accountability and ownership and responsibility, understanding the difference between these three aspects, and understanding where it's collective and where it is individual. And the other thing that I think did was also starting with why. So to your point, Padma, when you talked about if it's not repeatable, people lose interest, and absolutely so. So if we start with who are we working this for, who are we doing this for, so that's where, in my opinion, the whole human-centered design piece comes in. And then to David's point of looking at, okay, if there are 10 steps, how can we do this in a more effective manner? To me, that's where lean comes in, because you take out all the waste. That's the focus. And then to also then loop in your Scrum principles of inspect and adapt. That kind of worked for us. But it took us, about 18 months to really reach a point where we said, okay, now we are, to even get that foothold, I would say toehold. It took us 18 months, and that was an organization of about 400 people with 2 locations and clients all over North America, just to give you a sense of the scale.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank
you.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, that's also my biggest pain point. So it's top of the mind recall.
Yeah, I understand.
It's really hard. And I don't care whether it's healthcare, FinTech, others. I mean, my experience is those two, but it becomes a real easy excuse for not moving initiatives forward. And it shouldn't be. I remember attending a conference about a year and a half ago, which was put on by Oliver Wyman, and it was talking about building agility in organizations in the healthcare space. And the presenters in the main tent were from the entertainment industry, the financial services industry, everything except healthcare. And part of the reason that the organizers structured it that way is because healthcare, in fact, is one of the most complex industries from a regulatory perspective. I don't know outside of the US, although I suspect not far different. But when you think about this notion of the customer first, I'm absolutely astounded that our customers allow the industry to get away with what it gets away with in terms of complexity, in terms of understanding, embracing the new, digitizing the process, bringing the process more to the customer or the patient. It's a wonderful opportunity for the industry. And I hope it will be able to embrace it and take it forward.
When you talked about, I don't remember now how you started your remark, David, but that reminded me of this metaphor of using a GPS. So unless you move, you won't know if your GPS is pointed in the right direction or not. And for me, that metaphor always helps me. And I think that's where organizations have the most trouble, in my opinion. And we'll learn more in I'm sure in Erica's session tomorrow, where we talk about organizational agility in more detail. But the time an organization takes to take that first step, I think there's a lot of lost opportunity in that. And to me, setting up for success, the fact of it lies in that. How willing are we to experiment? Some of the things that David called out earlier. I think the bigger issue in larger organizations, large or small, is the fear of retribution. That's where the concept of psychological safety comes into play. How are your power structures within the organization, and how do you how does leadership or those in power, and David, you spoke about that, what does a leader who has some positional power within the organization, how do they react to experiments? And the other thing I do want to say here is that, and this is something I read somewhere, or I heard someone talk about this, that we generally talk about experiments as the outcomes of experiments, we tend to label them as success or failure, which is doesn't make sense. And until I heard that, you know, I used to think the same way. And you know, I'm a student of science, and I think that, oh, it failed or it passed. There's success or failure. But really, an outcome is an outcome because you started off doing an experiment, right? So you wanted a result, and if you didn't get it, what you got is another outcome. But we tend to label one as positive and one as negative when we say, okay, this is success and this is failure. But what you actually got is another outcome, and how you use, and that's, to me, is the crux of Scrum: inspect and adapt. You do something and you see where it goes. That's what we do when we use a GPS. If it ends up rerouting us, the GPS does it automatically sometimes, whether we want it or not, and that's another story. But really, it goes back to some of the things that David talked about in my mind: being forgiving, being kind, and that I don't think you can have courage to experiment if you don't have kindness to deal with the outcomes. And I think that that's one of the biggest struggles that organizations have, because, and to what Anne talked about earlier today, you know, she made the case very successfully, so I think, that you can't have organizational agility without personal agility. And so how each of us, and to David's point about, you know, sometimes consumers let organizations get complex because there's not enough resistance or enough questioning about it, right? Anyway, I wanted to talk about the GPS thing. Actually, that's where I started. My GPS went all over the place. I did
Good
see
point.
Valerie.
Great
Sorry.
point.
Yeah.
Great point and a great analogy.
Thank you. I know we are just 2 minutes more. I saw Valerie raise a hand. Do you have a question, Valerie? Go ahead.
No, I don't.
Oh, okay.
Well, actually, I think of it, or I use the term, a brainstorm culture. So how do you relate that to experiments? I mean, do you see that as the same thing?
I think it can be the same thing. I think depending on the level of engagement, I have seen brainstorm sessions that become opportunities for one or two people to express an opinion, and that is very difficult to break within an organization, and it tends to be a cultural thing. It's also very true when one is working in a global organization, unless you have the processes, the systems, the confidence of people that they have an opinion and they should voice it. So I would say to you that brainstorming sessions can be that, but it really depends on how the meeting is set and how the meeting is managed, and really important for whoever is the chairperson of that conversation to work really, really hard to engage people to ensure that participation is across the board. So a lot of ideas that don't get out there often, just because I don't have as big a voice as the next person.
So what's the alternative?
I think not so much an alternative, but a way of managing it. I think that okay. Having the right agenda, that having the right facilitation of the meeting,
okay,
that exchanging that facilitation role amongst people during the meeting, looking for an outcome, are things little things that can help in terms of the conversation.
Okay.
And I think importantly, again, go back to this notion of inclusion. everybody has an idea, and everybody often has a good idea. So let's find a way to get it out there.
Okay, that was good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Great question.
Absolutely. We are right at time. Are there any more questions before we close out? I just want to be conscious because we're all from different time zones.
Yeah, and I want to say one other thing, or two other things, if I may.
Yes, of course.
So Friday, remember, there's an opportunity. So if as you see me in your dreams, you think of a question that you should have asked, please keep it for Friday, and let's bring it to the panel conversation, because I'd love to have the opportunity for more of this conversation. The other part, and really, really important, there are some great sessions coming up tomorrow and over the next 4 days. And I think that, please, if you can, participate in them. Topics like the future of leadership tomorrow. Topics like organizational agility and what it really means and why it's important. And I don't want to call everybody out, but re-entering the workforce and reinventing yourself. There are some really interesting and aligned topics, and guess what? A different perspective. And one of the things that I said, and hopefully it stuck in addition to the dripping water, was this notion that some of the best results have come from projects and programs that started out with a very different objective. But because of inclusion and engagement, became very different in terms of business objective and delivery. And each of the speakers coming up will, I am sure, have a somewhat different perspective than me, a different experience than me. And that's all good. That's the richness of the tapestry that we're trying to create over this week. So please, if you can, participate and give them your support.
Well said. Thank you very much, David. And you actually did a part of my responsibilities here, so I'm just going to share my screen really quick. So the lineup for tomorrow, guys, just give me 2 more seconds. We actually kick off the day with Mindy. Mindy and I both are co-charia. That's our connection. Mindy just graduated from, among other things, just graduated from the co-charia ICF International Coaching Federation program, and she's an accredited coach. And that's how we met, not in person, only on Zoom. So Mindy kicks us off tomorrow with this session, Re-entering the Professional World, Reinventing Yourself. You've got this. And believe me, Mindy has a fantastic step-by-step guide to help us walk us through this. This is aimed at anyone that's looking to return to professional work. So moms coming back to work, people that are trying to pivot their careers. So anyone that's trying to come back or do something different, this is meant for them. That's at 8 o'clock Eastern tomorrow. Then followed by Catherine, who's also on this call right now. She's the owner of Catherine Spinney Coaching, and I met Catherine through Mindy. So that's your 6 degrees. Catherine is also an ICF certified coach, and she's going to talk to us about the future of leadership. That's another exciting session, and she's going to really look at what is it that the workplace is looking for. And she does a lot of work in that space already. So we're really excited to and looking forward to having her tomorrow. So that's at 11 a.m. Eastern. And then, again, speaking to us from the future, Erica, all the way from Auckland, New Zealand. She's going to talk more about organizational agility and why it's really important, what it really means, and why it's so important. And Erica is going to make the case for why organizational agility is all about the people. So that's our lineup for tomorrow. The rest of the lineup, you can see them either on our website, northstar@work.com/4IR, or you can also go to ubct.com, who's our technology partner. You'll see all the sessions listed there as well. Registrations are free and they're open, so please spread the word, and the more the merrier. The panel discussions that David was referring to, there are two. And the one that he was referring to right now is what we're going to close out this event with. That's on Friday at 11 a.m., May 15th, for us here in the US. And Rebecca, who's also on this call, another Cocharya connection. Rebecca and I are in the same cohort for our ICF training. Rebecca, David, and Srini, who I think had to drop off. The four of us actually are going to talk about collaborative leadership for a global workforce. So that's the panel discussion that David was referring to. And absolutely what he said, bring your questions. We do have a plan for us, but then bring your questions and we can talk some more about it. Really, thank you very much for taking the time for being here today. Have a great rest of your day, wherever you are.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks so much, guys. Bye.
Bye. See you tomorrow again, Erica.
Tomorrow.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Cool.